Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I've come to the United States straight out of a place called Wayanad in Kerala, a very rich district until 2 years ago, one of the richest districts in the state of Kerala, in which agriculture has collapsed, and there have been at least over 150 farmers' suicides since January last year. At the same time, in the urban metro of Delhi, at about the time I left, and in fact a little before I left, was a celebration of an activity of a different kind. On the one hand, you had these farmers committing suicide in extreme distress. On the other hand, we were witnessing a phenomenon that is about 3 to 5 years old now. Theme weddings. A theme wedding is where you take about an acre or two of land and put up a replica of a great monument, maybe the Taj Mahal, maybe the Sistine Chapel, if it's a Bengali wedding, even Kargil as a theme, and you spend millions and millions of rupees to put up a structure which is going to last 12 hours and then be dismantled after the wedding so as to ensure you exclusivity for your theme. So this can cost millions of rupees, in fact tens of millions of rupees, because I think the last one of the biggest was 3 crores, that's about 30 million rupees, is spent in creating this theme wedding. So on the one hand, you had these farmers committing suicide in extreme distress. On the other, you had this unbelievable display of opulence and wealth. But we'll come back to that story. I'm coming in from Seattle, where I noticed that the tsunami still makes front page, and that's as good a starting point as any. It's right here on the front page, carries over. There's more than a page, full page of tsunami stories in this, and I think it's a good starting point for our discussion tonight on inequality and the things you don't get to know from your media. Just let's take the tsunami. Now, all of us know that the tsunami struck on, and the stories you don't get to know, even if they do appear minorly in the press somewhere, give you a very different picture of the world functioning around the tsunami. Now, every one of us knows that the tsunami struck on December 26th, devastated 11 nations, 200,000 human beings died, 160,000 of them in 5 countries. And we know about the outpouring of generosity, etc., etc. Here's something perhaps that most people don't know. Of the 11 nations devastated by the tsunami, only 5 have anything approaching major stock exchanges. 5 countries of the 11 have major stock exchanges. These are India, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and Sri Lanka. Here's the news. Within 72 hours of the tsunami striking, as it became clear that the damage was phenomenal, every one of these 5 stock exchanges reached their historic high. Every one of these stock exchanges, the sensitive index went through the roof. The more the misery, the better the stock exchange did. The biggest records were set by the by the Jakarta Stock Exchange, where the maximum number of people, in a country where the maximum number of people died. The Sensex, the sensitive index of the Bombay Stock Exchange, reached an all-time high by January 3rd, when it was absolutely clear that the tsunami had been devastating in its impact. The JSX of Indonesia crossed one historic high after another. Every day it reached a different level. The SETI, the SETI of Thailand, the stock exchange of Bangkok, was higher than at any point it had been between 1997 and 2003. The KLSC, the Kuala Lumpur Stock Exchange of Malaysia, reached its highest in 5 years. And the CSE, the All-Share Index of the Sri Lankan Stock Exchange, clocked in at about 16 points below its highest ever since it was founded. Now, if it had happened with one stock exchange, coincidence. All five, the worst five affected countries have the best performing stock exchanges. What conclusion do we draw from it? Well, one conclusion that you can draw from it, though paradoxically it doesn't apply in this case, one conclusion is generally true. The majority of those hit by the tsunami were trivial and meaningless to the stock markets. Yet, they were meaningful enough to send the stock markets through the roof. How did that happen and why? The people affected were mainly fisher folk, poor people, domestic servants, people crowded into poor quarters along the coast. So many of them have absolutely no participation in the stock markets. So to that extent, they're marginal and trivial to the functioning of markets. However, the stock markets of our time also represent the interests of those who make money out of grief. The sense that sent the markets soaring was the smell of reconstruction dollars coming in. So the greater the misery, the greater the dollars, the better the stock exchange did. No coincidences. You can play that for one stock exchange, not for the five stock exchanges of the five worst affected countries. One of the great successes of economists and economics in the last 20 years is that we've completely divorced how economies are doing from how people are doing. Economies can boom while people sink. And we've made stock markets central indicators of how economies and nations are doing. By that yardstick, the greater the misery of the people, the greater the misery of those hit by the tsunami, the better the stock markets did. And the better the stock markets did, the better the nation is doing, because it's a central indicator of how national economies are doing. So the more miserable the poor, the better the countries are doing. In fact, I think it's a perfect metaphor of what's really happening in the world. Consider that the same sensitive index of the Bombay Stock Exchange, the Sensex, in May 2004, at the moment of the greatest triumph of the Indian people, when an electorate of 600 million voters showed the world what democracy was about, going to the polls in orderly democratic fashion. And actually, we know how to run elections. And some countries still do. And an electorate of 600 million people went out and against the predictions, the desires, the desperate desires of the Indian elite, the upper middle classes, every single opinion poll, exit poll, the intellectual elite, the pundits of the television channels, just annihilated the government they did not want. Just did it against all the predictions and against the majority of the editorials in the newspapers, which took for granted that the government was going to return to power. That was the greatest moment of triumph of the Indian people. What happened? The stock market collapsed to its worst position in many, many years. At the point when the Indian people scored their greatest triumph, the stock market collapsed. At a time of enormous misery of the poor, the stock market reached its historic high, crossing 6,600 on the sensitive index for the first time. That's why I call the Sensex the misery index. It operates in inverse proportion to the happiness of the greatest number. But the tsunami was also remarkable, right, for its outpouring of generosity. I'm sure the generosity was genuine, and it would be nice, as the United Nations says last week, if the money actually showed up, because less than a third of what was committed has actually shown up. In the case of the Bam earthquake in Iran, less than 2% of what was committed has actually shown up 2 years later. But yeah, I'm sure that generosity was deeply appreciated by all those affected fishermen I saw in the Nagapattinam coast, who were wondering what to do with the large numbers of neckties that have been gifted to them, and discarded heavy overcoats as well. So, there's piles and piles of neckties along the place, which, sent to them in thoughtful kindness. I'm sure it will be appreciated even more when the money actually comes in. I was asked on the way here about the fact that The Indian government did not allow in foreign relief agencies. It's about the only time in 15 years I have found myself agreeing with the decision of the Indian government. The last time you had 12 major agencies functioning after the Gujarat earthquake, they collected millions and millions and millions of dollars because of their capacity to put... Oh, right now, tsunami commercials are still running on television from international non-profit agencies. 75 cents can save a child sort of stuff. It might save the non-profit in question, but beyond that, I have no idea what it would do. The audit report of those 12 agencies, which functioned after the Gujarat earthquake, shows that they did not succeed in spending more than 20 to 25% of the money they collected, but effectively blocked those resources from hundreds of smaller local organizations that would have been infinitely more effective. Second, much of the money that they did spend, the 20%, was spent on building specially constructed, heat-controlled, temperature-controlled, air-conditioned tents for the activists who came in, while the victims of the earthquake froze in the Gujarat winter. And that was one of the reasons why they were not allowed in again, and I'm very glad they weren't allowed in. This is still not to deny the generosity of millions of individuals, not to deny the extraordinary coverage of the media of the tsunami. However, in the same period, if you take the district that was worst affected by the tsunami in India, it's a district called Nagapattinam in the southern state of Tamil Nadu. Over there, the tsunami destroyed 30,300 houses at one blow. That was the worst affected district in the country. In the same period that the tsunami destroyed 30,300 houses in Nagapattinam, the government of Maharashtra destroyed 84,000 houses in a week or two in the metropolis of Mumbai, with bulldozers, police squads, and extreme use of force. 84,000 houses, which is 2.5 times the number of homes that were destroyed in Nagapattinam, were destroyed in Mumbai. How much coverage did you see of that? Right? You didn't see much of that coverage, right? Not only, by the way, this was one of the most major violations of human rights in recent times. It is a violation of a United Nations resolution to which India was one of the earliest signatories, the 1993 United Nations resolution on terming forced evictions as a barbaric and gruesome violation of human rights. Yet, the demolitions, though unprecedented in their cruelty, people were not allowed to take their possessions out of the huts. There were hundreds and thousands of kids have lost their school certificates, their college certificates, their birth certificates, those who actually had them. A lot of the women lost all their household utensils. They were not allowed to take these out in the demolitions because they wanted to make sure that they didn't come back. Having destroyed this, the city's elites then demanded and have filed a petition that the poor people in the slums be stripped of their voting rights because they're very scared. The Indian poor have a nasty way of getting back at you through the ballot box. So they've actually filed a petition in the High Court saying that these poor people should be stripped of their voting rights. How much coverage did you see of all this? How much coverage did you see? In fact, you couldn't, because though the newspapers were forced to cover it, it was too big not to ignore. Many, many stories, very sensitive stories, were actually killed in the newsrooms of the major newspapers. Some of these stories were, how did I see the stories? That's another story. Some of these stories were interviews with bulldozer drivers who demolished the slums, with the policemen who gave protection to the demolition squads. The bulldozer drivers, some of them said, "We did it weeping in our hearts, for we too live in slums and we know our turn will come." The police constables giving protection to the demolition also live in slums. And they did not take any pleasure in the actions that they were forced to undertake by the government of Maharashtra. The people doing the demolition were from the slums. Incidentally, a United Nations Habitat report of around late 2003 makes the assessment that by 2030, 25 years from now, fully 1/3 of all humanity will live in urban slums. 1/3. The largest number of those are going to be in India and Africa. None of this got covered. Even in covering the tsunami, this is the mindset of inequality. What happened? The poor have no rights. Even in the coverage of the tsunami, whatever was done for the tsunami victims was a result not of their rights, but of our generosity. You are going to get a new house, not because you're a citizen of a decent society, not because you're entitled to one, which you are under the directive principles of the Indian Constitution. You're not going to get a house because of that. You're going to get a house because I am sorry that half your family was washed away in the tsunami. It's not about your rights, it's about my generosity. We've reduced people to that. We've reduced the poor to the objects of our generosity and our sympathy. You build your own home, we'll demolish it. But we'll give you a new one. If we choose to, that is, if we feel sorry for you. How agonized we are over how people die, how untroubled we are by how they live. If you look at the Indian stock market, coming back to that central indicator of how economies are doing, the Confederation of Indian Industry, which has the most optimistic take on such figures, says that the total number of people having any kind of investments in the stock exchange constitute less than 1.15%. I repeat, 1.15% of India's 180 million plus households. 1.15% of households. That's the most optimistic figure of those participating in any kind of investments in the stock markets. Yet, as I told, when the stock market collapsed in May 2004, it collapsed for all of 2 days. The country's largest newspaper had a front page mimicking 9/11. Ground zero, said the headline. 2,340 billion rupees lost, notional money, which came back 2 days later, notionally. And it had an aircraft flying into the stock exchange building, and the tail of the aircraft had the communist hammer and sickle. Well, when the stock exchange collapsed for all of 48 hours, this was following what every political analyst across the spectrum says is India's second most historic election since its independence. 1977 after the emergency and 2004. The finance minister of the country abandoned the first day of parliament, did not attend the first day of the new historic parliament. He came rushing to Bombay to the stock market to dry the tears and hold the hands of distraught millionaires of Dalal Street. Well, because 2 days later it was okay, but he stayed there 3 days to make sure that the market behaved. Then he went home. It was meanwhile, an election that was very largely fought in at least 2 states on the issue of farmers' suicides. It took another 149 suicides of farmers in the southern state of Andhra Pradesh before the Prime Minister condescended to visit the place. But a twitch in the Sensex had the finance minister jetting out to Mumbai. That is the difference of attention. That's the difference in the attention you get if you are poor or if you are rich. So it's all about our generosity and our feelings and whom we are feeling sorry for today or who we feel sorry for most of the time. If you start applying these measures to the various forms of generosity that you see, you'll get a very different picture from what you get through the tsunami coverage. One of my favorite forms of generosity is the drive to wipe out malaria in the third world. Some of you may have read about this, the planned distribution of millions of bed nets to protect people against malaria. Have you read about this or heard about this? It's a plan involving the WHO, the World Bank, and anyone else out to make a dollar. The fun part of this malaria nets thing is, by 1980, India had more or less successfully contained malaria. It was almost wiped out by the early 1980s. In the 1980s, and up to in the 1990s, we entered the brave new world of structural adjustment, of huge cuts in public services, privatization of medical services in a large way, soaring costs of medical attention. 21% of the Indian rural public no longer seek medical attention for their ailments. That's the latest figure we have, because they simply cannot afford it. Okay? Now, After all these cuts, malaria resurfaces with a vengeance in India and in neighboring countries. Having caused it to resurface in the first place, now generosity demands that we distribute bed nets, millions of bed nets to people who don't have beds. Now, if you're living in a hut, you don't fix your bed net to the wall because you don't sleep close to the wall because that's where the creepy crawlies reside, the scorpions and other stuff. You try sleeping a little away from the wall. I'm a rural reporter. I spent 270 days of every year for the last 12 years in the villages. And self-preservation causes you to figure out these sort of things about where you sleep and where you don't sleep. Okay? So first, we're giving these bed nets to people who don't have beds. At a cost of God knows how many millions of dollars. It's planned. Every time it's been attacked, they have withdrawn quietly, only to try and bring it back through the next government. Now, if anyone with half a brain knows that even if this nets, oh, by the way, you'll forgive the gendered language, it isn't mine, it's theirs. It says that these bed nets will protect you against malaria because the nets are impregnated with anti-mosquito repellent. Whatever that means. Now, anyone with half a brain knows that the malaria, anyone with, we'll exempt the experts, right? We're talking about people. Anyone knows that the malaria mosquito is not most active when you sleep. It is most active at dawn and dusk when people are in the fields. Of course, you could make a bold new fashion statement by walking about in your net, but it might cramp your style. Right? The whole thing is one unmitigated racket. This is the generosity. The generosity, the charity that begins at home and stays there. Right? It has nothing to do with the eradication of malaria in these countries. Speaking of malaria, one of the astonishing things you can look at in the spectrum of inequality across the globe, both in the terms of what's happening and in terms of how the media cover it, is what I call the globalization of communicable diseases. Anyone in the audience remember this word? SARS? Rings a bell? Yeah, it does, doesn't it? You remember how SARS was perceived moving about like the Black Death, mowing down millions in its deadly wake? You know how many people actually died of SARS in India? 0. SARS, 0. You can look at the World Health Organization's website on the subject. Total number of cases identified in India? 3. But from the coverage you got in the media, you'd think that SARS, the subcontinent was in danger of its survival, right? For the way it was covered. 3 cases of SARS, 0 deaths from SARS. Why did SARS get so much attention? And by the way, I'm not saying SARS is not dangerous. You're going to get a hell of a lot more of SARS by other names and not in the not too distant future. Because we have globalized communicable diseases through the strategies of the last 10, 15 years. Through the policies of the last 10, 15 years. However, it's important to look at why SARS or plague got, in 94 we had a plague in India. Every aircraft going out of India was sprayed while going out, sprayed while being received at in airports in the West. The plague killed 53 people. SARS, worldwide, in its 100 days, according to the World Health Organization's website, in the 100 days of its existence in the first round, across the planet, SARS killed 879 human beings. That's about half the number of people who die of tuberculosis every day in India. But TB never gets the same kind of coverage because it kills the wrong people. SARS germs, plague germs, kill the beautiful people. So they get that kind of attention in the media, in the medical systems, in the government's policies. Plague germs, SARS germs, they are notorious for their non-observance of class distinctions. They board aircraft and fly club class to New York, and that scares the pants of the world. Right? So they affect the wrong kinds of people. And I'm not just talking about poor countries. How many people are aware that in August 2003, in October 2003, the government of France, one of the best off countries in the world, the government of France acknowledged that in August 2003, 15,000 senior French citizens had died in a heat wave. Now, France has had heat waves before. Why did 15,000 people die in that heat wave? And why is it that all those 15,000 citizens were elderly, pensioners, and retirees? You know, the thing is, 879 people from SARS in 100 days, 15,000 people in rich France in the space of a month. And it didn't make the world headlines because they were largely poor, elderly pensioners whose health benefits had been subjected to severe cuts in the preceding 2 or 3 years. That's why they died. If it had been 800 people of the flying classes, you got that kind of coverage. When 15,000, and again, we're not talking about Bangladesh or India, we're talking about France. 15,000 senior citizens died. It didn't make news. You can get onto the net and look at the figures and the discussion. They had a special parliamentary commission to go into it. I don't know what came of it. It might also be interesting to look at why China was the worst affected country by SARS. And that has a lot to do with what we're discussing today. In the 90s, in the 80s and 90s, we entered this world of structural adjustment, cuts in subsidies, cuts in basic services, withdrawal of entitlements of poor people, and privatization of just about everything, including soul and intellect. The Chinese government closed tens of thousands of factories. Now, if you're a citizen of China, you accessed your health through your workplace, through your school, your factory, or the local network that you were aligned with. When tens of thousands of factories were closed down across China, millions of workers lost their access to health. The chain of command, the alarm system, the signal system by which a new disease got reported and got checked at the labs in the tertiary level, that system completely collapsed. Therefore, when SARS hit, there was no plot on the Chinese government's part to conceal it. For most of the time, they really didn't know because they had destroyed the system by which they could have known. They destroyed it to save a few $1 million and lost a few $1 billion because the depredations you visit on the poor tend to come back to you. The Chinese, that was the year that the Chinese GDP took its worst hit in a decade and a half. Also, leaving severe scars on the GDP of Singapore, Thailand, and a number of other countries also hit by SARS. The great software festival of China was cancelled. China lost billions of dollars, though it saved some millions, in throwing workers out of work, throwing workers out of their factories. So that happened with China. Did I mention France? In this country, I have no idea, I don't think there's a clear estimate, how many elderly Americans cross the border into Mexico and Canada to buy drugs. Okay? I do know that your federal government has responded to it by conducting police raids on pharmacies in Michigan. Not by trying to provide cheaper drugs to poor people, but by conducting police raids on pharmacies in Michigan and on the Mexican border to prevent people from getting cheaper drugs. Okay? In Africa, thanks to the new institutional arrangements under TRIPS and the WTO, under the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights and the WTO, an Indian company which produced so far the cheapest, the company's name is Cipla, which produced the cheapest anti-AIDS drug. Millions of Africans were denied the right to get this drug at dirt cheap prices by the intervention of multinational corporations of the pharmaceutical sector. After a huge outcry, after considerable outrage across the world, a compromise was reached, but the owner of the company will tell you that he can still provide it much cheaper if it were not for the pressures working on him nationally and internationally. In other words, the profits of corporations in this unequal world rate far above the lives of millions of Africans. That is absolutely clear. It's crystal clear from the conclusion about it. Yet, the game is unraveling. We'll get into some of the numbers of inequality a little later if you wish, but let's look at some surprising things that are happening. The guys running the game know it's unraveling. They're aware that things are not going as per plan. And maybe the plan was different in any case. But with one of the fundamental features of our time being the increasing and growing disconnect between mass media on the one hand and mass reality on the other, you don't often get to see these things highlighted. Let me quote three very, very important people and institutions. Our planet is not balanced. Too few control too much, and too many have too little to hope for. Too much turmoil, too many wars, too much suffering. Now, depending on who you are, that sounds either like Subcomandante Marcos of the Zapatistas or Mother Teresa. It's actually James Wolfenson of the World Bank speaking. That's James Wolfenson at the joint World Bank-IMF meeting in Dubai. You know, nowadays the World Bank and the IMF are very careful to pick as venues places like Dubai, Riyadh, other places known for freedom of expression to hold their meetings in, so that all you protesters can go there and say what you like. Now this is Wolfenson speaking about concentration, inequality, too few own too much, too few control too much. Look at the language. It's very different from the gung-ho, trickle-down claptrap that you had for 15 years before that. 3 days after Wolfenson spoke, this was towards the end of 2003, a small paragraph appeared in the International Herald Tribune about the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which, if you remember, during the Southeast Asian financial crisis, together with the United States government, Washington and others, nearly brought down the Malaysian government of Muhammad Mahathir for being recalcitrant and creating a crisis, blah, 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 blah. 3 days after Wolfenson speaks, from the same meeting comes an acknowledgement from the IMF that the IMF has since accepted that Mahathir's capital and currency controls formula actually worked. You nearly brought down an elected government because it didn't conform to your prescriptions. And then calmly, 5 years later, you say, well, you know, our shucks, we got it slightly wrong. We just blew the whole region apart by doing so, but, you know, we're admitting it. Around the same time, the third member of the Trinity spoke. This is the Oracle, the Wall Street Journal. And we'll come to the Wall Street Journal in greater detail in a minute. A few days after Wolfenson got it off his chest, the Wall Street Journal came up with this very original line. Well, original for the Wall Street Journal anyway. It wrote, the Wall Street Journal said editorially, yes, markets are a great way to organize economic activity, but markets need adult supervision. Gee, if they'd figured that out 20 years ago, millions of lives would have been spared. Now, I think there's a strong case that the World Bank, the IMF, and the Wall Street Journal are in urgent requirement of adult supervision. But, all three of them are now hedging on what's going wrong. They know that that market fundamentalism has run its course, that things are going very badly wrong. Throughout the 90s, to even suggest that the market was not God was to invite derision, attack, ridicule of a very abusive nature. Right? The market wasn't just good for democracy. The market is democracy. You can't separate these two things. Now, as it begins to unravel, let me give you the later thoughts of the Wall Street Journal on the elections in India. This is the same newspaper that argued that markets are democracy, etc., etc. Here is the Wall Street Journal. It writes 5 days after the Indian election results, because that's how much time it took to get out of the trauma. Democracy is perverse. Democracy is perverse. It's attacking the Indian election results. Democracy is perverse. Although it is natural for the United States to suggest that all countries should embrace democracy, the lesson from India is that Western nations cannot be dogmatic about elections, except when they're in Iraq. The lesson from India is that Western nations cannot be dogmatic about elections. The journal continues, as India's elections will testify, this is on their op-ed or edit page, as India's elections will testify, democracy is not always supportive of coherent economic policy and prosperity. You want me to translate that for you? It means that that the voters are really dumb and very dangerous, and let's coddle them. Continue, verbatim quote. The West should be more hesitant about promoting political competition. For alas, that could destroy the leadership, unquote, that pursues real economic change. So don't promote elections and stuff. For God's sake, these miserable peasants in India go and change governments that are promoting markets. The WSJ continues. The lesson is that if India wants to be an economic power, it has to pay heed to the global voter known as the investor. If India wants to, screw your electorate. You want to be a power, you pay attention to the global voter known as the investor. And then it adds as an afterthought, because it may not look all that democratic, in addition to your own voters at home. Gee, thanks. We can listen to our own people so long as they think the way you want them to. But surely that's a regression. But let me not put it all at the door of the Wall Street Journal. We have far more enthusiastic people at home, like the editors of our own newspapers, one of whom wrote when the collapse took place. In 2004, no government, just before the election, this editor wrote 2 pieces. In 2004, no government that the markets see as hostile can survive. Just before the election, he also wrote that the era of mass elections, mass meetings, door-to-door campaigning and election rallies is over. Elections will now be decided on the basis of what people learn from the media. As famous last words, those ranked alongside Tarzan's, "Who greased the grapevine?" He also made a pronouncement on after the crash. The markets have spoken. He had read the entrails of the market, like the ancient wizards who read the entrails of the whatever animal that they made miserable. Now, all the other newspapers in the West contributed to the building of this tiger economy model, this emerging tiger stuff, when in fact inequality was being entrenched at a devastating pace. Let me give you the example of the New York Times. Mr. Keith Bradshaw, renowned investigative journalist of the New York Times and expert on the automobile industry, which of course qualifies him immediately to comment on Indian agriculture, is sent to the southern state of Andhra Pradesh to deify the greatest, the most beloved third world leader in the West, Mr. Chandrababu Naidu from my home state of Andhra Pradesh. If you Google this name tonight, or you check LexisNexis, you will find that no third world leader, the only other third world leader who will get you an equal number of hits is probably Saddam Hussein. Okay? But for totally different reasons. Naidu was the darling of the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, etc. Mr. Bradshaw, in analyzing, also joined the list of famous last words and said that Mr. Naidu's party is set to retain power. This was before they suffered the biggest electoral defeat in the history of that state in decades. Mr. Naidu's party is set, my home state of Andhra Pradesh, it speaks a language called Telugu. Some 70-80 million people speak this language. And Mr. Bradshaw wisely commented, he studied the problem very closely. He visited the place for all of 6 hours or so, and declared that Mr. Naidu's party seems set to regain power in the coming elections because he and his party speak Telugu. Now this is, the rest of Andhra Pradesh speaks Esperanto. Right. This is like saying that Tony Blair and the Labour Party are set to retain power because they speak English. Which of course there might be a strong case for, because earlier it was Cockney. Right. So, anyway, all these predictions went awry, and you can see how angry they are with democracy when it works against them. Because the poor there spoke decisively. Anyway, if you look at how, more on the free market. Has anyone seen the new patent laws and seed laws of Iraq? There's a free market for you. A completely imposed free market in perpetuity and in eternity captive to Halliburton and MCI and a number of other multinationals. Halliburton gets exclusive monopoly rights to import oil into a country with the second largest reserves of that commodity in the world, at about 2.5 times the price of that commodity in that part of the world, exclusive rights of exclusive importation. A friend of mine calculated that it would be cheaper to drive the oil down by limo from Kuwait than to buy it at Halliburton's price. You should see these patent laws and seed laws. The people of Iraq didn't even know that they needed a seed law. It's been written by the Monsantos, the Cargills, and these guys. It's been, whatever other doubts you might have about the law, you can see that it's been written by the lawyers of American corporations. The language, the tone, everything is unmistakable. A country has been reduced to a colony in perpetuity. It doesn't matter how representative the government of Iraq is tomorrow. It can have the free market precludes Iraqi ownership of any Iraqi asset of significance. Okay? Soon after Saddam fell, a couple of very entrepreneurial young guys started a cell phone network, which was shut down physically by your army and handed over to MCI, which had no previous experience of building networks in such places. Right? That's the free market. I'm sure the Iraqis will be very grateful. I see them expressing it every day. The opening up process in many ways now, in many of these countries, resembles the opium wars of the 19th century. But let's look at this growth of inequality worldwide. Inequality has grown faster in the last 15 years than in the preceding 50. It's grown faster in the last 15 years than in the preceding 50. Every single report of the United Nations Development Programme's Human Development Report, which has been coming out since 1990-91, shows you this and shows you that it has intensified with every single successive year. The income gap between the top 20% of the world's population and the bottom fifth has more than doubled. By 1998, the top 20% consumed 86% of all goods and services. The bottom fifth of the world's population are currently living on 1.2% of the world's resources and services, goods and services. The world's richest 200 people doubled their net worth in 4 years leading to 1998. Which means that they more than doubled their net worth in 4 years to over $1 trillion. And the assets of the top 3 billionaires are more than the combined gross national product of all least developed countries and their 600 million people put together. By 2004, the position had actually worsened. To that point is what I think the bank and the fund were beginning to worry about. That things are not going as planned, or maybe they were going as planned but too well. Russia, look at the rest of the world. Russia, once the second superpower in the world, was subjected to shock therapy in the 90s and other doctrines of market fundamentalism. The former USSR lost 42% of her gross domestic product. No mean achievement, because no country has lost 42% of its GDP without either a war or a famine. Russia managed that with only the IMF and Jeffrey Sachs, without war or famine. Every year now, if you check it out, 400 to 500 people die in Moscow, in the vicinity of Moscow, of hypothermia, of cold, in the cold of Moscow in winter, while every year the number of Mercedes-Benzes sold in Moscow has soared. The sale of Mercedes-Benzes has gone up in every one of those years, that more and more people have died of hypothermia. In fact, so many new boutiques and fashion boutiques and designer stores have opened in Moscow, that when Armani opened his designer store in Moscow, the International Herald Tribune mocked him gently, saying he was Giorgio come lately, because everyone else, Versace, Bulgari, all of them were already there. And all this time, people were dying of hypothermia in the city. China, long one of the most egalitarian societies in the world, is now seeing gaps between its coastal areas and its rural interior that it has not seen perhaps in 100 years. the Chinese People's Procuratorate, a watchdog body of their Communist Party, the People's Procuratorate of China, towards the end of 2003, came out with a report saying that report on various things in which it mentioned that two of the giant and rapidly growing sectors of the economy are, one is corruption, the other is prostitution. That was the watchdog body of the Communist Party of China speaking. It forced them, in fact, to have a special session in their last Congress on this issue of inequality. It's in China, it's in India, it's in Russia. And by the way, just harking back to but all this doesn't gain ground because you have, as you see every night on every single one of your television channels, the giant soothsayer industry. It's getting better. Things are actually getting a lot better. It's the baseline statistical, it's the baseline game. If you draw the baseline in the last ice age, everybody is doing better. And it's also the statistical averaging game, which we won't get into here. But just to give you an idea of the way of looking at growth, for instance, which do you think was the fastest growing economy in 2003 in the world? Afghanistan. Afghanistan was the fastest growing economy in the world at 21%. See, Afghanistan's GNP doubles if you just stop bombing. Okay, you build one school. It's a vast improvement. But by the conventional measures of growth, was the fastest growing economy in 2003. And the United Nations, however, humbly added that 50% of that growth came from the cultivation and sale of opium. Because you've destroyed any other means of livelihood for poor people in that country. They just cannot earn another way. What about Africa? How did Africa do in all this? Ask Joseph Stiglitz, former chief economist of the World Bank, sacked for his incompatibility or incompetence, which of course immediately qualified him for the Nobel Prize. As he points out, the African continent, subjected to forcibly imposed policies of the IMF and the World Bank, has lost nearly a fourth of her income. Even as African cotton farmers who grow the cheapest cotton in the world go bankrupt, American cotton producers, not farmers, because these are corporations, not farmers, get an annual subsidy of about $1 million each. No one can compete against that. So great is Africa's overall crisis today, and I think it's worth considering this point in view of all the amount of concern about outsourcing, that today, according to the Financial Times, the entire continent of Africa has just 20,000 engineers and scientists to serve a continent of 600 million people, because today there are more African scientists and doctors and engineers working in the United States than in all of Africa. Okay? And much of this drain of medical personnel has come from South Africa, the country facing the world's largest AIDS pandemic. So when we're talking about outsourcing, let's look at this reverse factor as well. Let's look at what's happening. Let's look at the millions of manufacturing jobs lost in China by the new process of liberalization, privatization, and globalization that's taken place. 200 jobs lost here. Phenomenal outcry. And yes, what's being promoted, and that should be the way of viewing it, is a race to the bottom. Keep finding people who will work cheaper and cheaper and cheaper until you drive them into the ground. That's the game. It's a race to the bottom. It's not jobs stolen by one set of poor people from another set of poor people. In India, in the last few years, the inequality has, that's why I started with the theme weddings, the inequality has reached such proportions. Let me tell you some truths about the tiger economy. I speak very bravely these days because I have an election of 2004 behind me. Every time I spoke before that, my God, it used to infuriate people if I told them that this is what the government data shows. At a time when India was being promoted as the emerging tiger economy, its per capita food availability in 2003 was lower than it had been during the Bengal famine of 1942-43. You can check that figure in the pre-budget economic survey, a document that the government of India places in Parliament at the time of the budget session of Parliament. Amartya Sen's figures will show you that the per capita availability of food grain in the Bengal famine was 147.5 kilograms per Indian. In 2003, it was 141.7 kilograms per Indian. 7 kilograms less than it had been during the Bengal famine. In this period, we were still implementing the structural adjustment policies of export-led growth. In a period when per capita availability of food grain was so low, India exported 13 million tons of food grain in 18 months at a price far lower than that at which she sells it to poor people in her own country. We exported that grain to overseas markets at 5 rupees 40 paise a kilogram, while selling it to poor people in Andhra Pradesh at 6 rupees 45 paise a kilogram. And then we boasted, look at our mountains of food grain. Mountains of food grain existed because the structural adjustment programs had so effectively destroyed the purchasing power of the poor that they could not buy food at those prices. It was that hunger that drove the kind of election results you saw last year. Once we entered the brave new world of liberalization and privatization, India cut development expenditure from her budgets, cut development expenditure from her plan outlays from 14.5% of gross domestic product to 5.9% of her gross domestic product. That is a cataclysmic fall from, that's a fall of about 30,000 crores, which is about $7 billion. We removed $7 billion from development expenditure. But we didn't just remove $7 billion. When $7 billion is invested in the Indian rural economy, it converts into about $30 to $35 billion of rural income. We blew that income away. And that's when the crisis began. That's when the farmers' suicides began. That's when our agrarian crisis took off. That's when thousands of farmers committed suicide between 1997 and 2003, becoming the lead issue in at least 2 or 3 states in the election, the suicides of thousands of farmers, which have had the misfortune, the total misfortune of being the mug who has to cover. Don't think that farmers' suicides are something that happen only in India. They happen right here in the United States. Maybe they don't all get reported as suicides because there are 2 problems associated with the reporting of suicides all over the world. One is stigma. The second in USA is insurance. So a lot of them, if you speak to the farm unions here, they will tell you that the number of suicides which are not necessarily reported as suicides, but as accidents, because you don't want to deny the family insurance. In India, there are at least 7 ways in which you can undermine the suicide figures, and that was the investigation I did between 2001 and 2004 in Andhra Pradesh, which I'm now doing in Kerala, and finding out that the number of suicides in the rich district of Wayanad, Kerala, is as intense as in the poor district of Anantapur in Andhra Pradesh. Because cartels have emerged at the global level, which are controlling and rigging commodity prices. Commodity prices have collapsed at the level of the producer, at the level of the wholesale, at the level of the small farmer. They haven't changed much at the global level. Each time one of you goes out there and buys a cup of coffee, 1/20th of what you pay for that cup of coffee goes to the guy who spends his life growing that coffee in Wayanad or in Brazil. The rest goes to Sara Lee, to Kraft, to Nestle's, to Starbucks, and to the big boys. Okay, that's how the world of commodities is now rigged. The prices of commodities are falling for the producer right in this country. In the United States between 94 and 99, consumer prices at the markets actually rose 2.8%. But family farm prices crashed 37.5% in this very country. We're just slaughtering the small farms, the small households across the world. If you look at your farm subsidies, which are leading to suicides in Africa, for instance, they didn't go to small farmers in the United States. They went to 26 Fortune 500 corporations. I was delighted to find who your struggling small farmers were when I checked the Associated Press database on this story. I cried buckets when I realized that, poor old guys standing in the line for handouts of agricultural subsidies in the United States included Ted Turner and Scottie Pippen. And not to forget David Rockefeller. Yeah, they're all listed as recipients of agricultural subsidies in this country. Whereas your small farmer is going bust. I worked for a semester while teaching in the University of Iowa in the late 90s, in 1998, where every day I read in the paper about another family farm going belly up. More foreclosures, more farms closing. And once the farmers of Iowa had a spectacular protest where they came and released lots of hogs in the streets of one of the towns nearby. And they explained that while the price of pork in the supermarket had not fallen 1 cent on the pound, their prices had collapsed. So somewhere, the money was going somewhere. Where was it going? This is happening in the United States. Farmer suicides are occurring in the United Kingdom, up to the 2001, for which figures are available, at 2.5 a week on average. Okay? They're occurring in Burkina Faso and Mali in Africa, where cotton growers of Burkina Faso are getting wiped out by the subsidies of the EU and the United States. All over the world, that small farmer is getting wiped out to the benefit of corporations. That's the kind of situation you're looking at. In Latin America, along the world's most unequal region, inequality rose so sharply in the 90s, which was terrible for a continent that had seen 100 million people fall already below the poverty line in the 1980s. They had 2 rounds of shock therapy. There's an Oxfam figure that tells us that in Mexico alone, an additional 11 million people fell below the poverty line between 1990 and 96. Worldwide, as FAO Director General Jacques Diouf points out, in the last 15 years, in which rich countries increased subsidies to their farmers or agricultural producers, poor countries went from being net exporters of food to net importers. India is the country that produces the best spices of pepper in the world. They come from Malabar. Many explorers from the West in the medieval ages used to sail to India looking for Malabar pepper. Malabar pepper is premium grade pepper as against 4 other lower grades of pepper. Malabar pepper has collapsed because the new laws allow people to import 3rd grade, 4th grade pepper into India, remix it with Malabar pepper and re-export it to rich markets. So farmers in that very rich district of Wayanad, that is the source of most of the Malabar pepper, are committing suicide in very large numbers. In coffee, the coffee prices have collapsed by a factor of 10. Pepper prices have collapsed just through the floor. Vanilla prices have collapsed. Cardamom prices have collapsed. But if you get onto the multi-commodities exchange websites, you'll find that at the global level, the prices have not fallen so much. Somebody is making the money, and those are corporations. These are the driving force of the new inequality that's going on. India is a classic example of engineered inequality. Oh, the New York Times had some time ago a front page article celebrating the birth of a class of people who spend their weekend at the mall. Isn't that delightful? And some of the letters that came in from India were also illogical. You know, there were many. I noticed a few NRI exchanges proudly about, have you seen this article? Everybody is spending time at the mall in India. It would have to be a very big mall. While all this celebration was going on, per capita food availability was falling. At a time when the tiger economy was being painted, India's position in the rank of nations in the Human Development Index of the United Nations fell from 124 to 127, which places us below for the poor people, not for rich people, because India's rich are richer, I think, than some of North America's rich. However, it places you below, for the quality of life for poor people, it places you below El Salvador. It places us below Botswana and the occupied territories of the Palestine. So here, it's pretty much like the tsunami model. The greater the misery of the poor, the greater the achievement of the markets. The greater the misery of the poor, the better the rich are doing. And here we come to this thing of, what does that inequality growing in I've traced it for you now in all the continents, in Africa, in Europe, wherever. It's happening in Japan, again one of the more egalitarian societies in many senses. It's happening and growing very rapidly in Japan, where the Japanese are under severe pressure to privatize their pension funds, to privatize their provident funds, to privatize their simplified life insurance and postal insurance and postal savings. And who are the ones forcing them to do the privatization? Same bunch of corporations. Okay. Now the kind of gaps that are coming up between rich and poor. In 2002 in this country, Professor Paul Krugman of Princeton wrote that essay on inequality, and there's also another brilliant essay by Jamie Galbraith on the perfect crime, inequality in the global age, where Krugman argues, quite correctly in my opinion, that obscene levels of inequality don't merely threaten economic well-being. They threaten and undermine the existence of democracy itself. After all, huge inequality was the mindset that was the basis of slavery. When I earned 1,000,000 times more than you, when I had physical control over you, you were my slave, I had to treat you as less than a human being. To be able to commit those atrocities on you, I had to deem that you were not a human being. That's how I rationalized my position. You're an animal. You're not a human being. The kind of gaps that worry Paul Krugman, and that makes me a little, I would take the point slightly differently. He says that the United States is, and that is correct, has never been as unequal today as it is today since the eve of the Great Depression of 1929. That is correct. I agree with that. Second, he says that the gaps between CEO and poorest worker, and the worker at the bottom, says Professor Krugman, when you cross 1:1,000, you're harming democracy, you're harming the way you function as a society, you're destroying people's rights, you're changing the mindset of the human being in very, very disturbing directions. Now this was interesting because when he wrote this essay at the same time, I was measuring the same gaps in my own society. I took the earnings of CEOs in Indian society, which are regularly published in a celebratory fashion in the Economic Times, which is a sister publication of the Times of India, which is never tired of telling you it is the largest English newspaper in the world, run by Bennett, Coleman and Co., more affectionately known as Bandit, Conman and Co. And the gap between the top CEO and the average agricultural worker, landless agricultural laborer, was not 1:1,000, which terrified Krugman, was not 1:5,000, not even 1:8 or 10,000, it was 1:30,000. Now let's take a joint venture of India and United States. Anyone remember this word? Enron? When Enron, the gap between the Indian CEO and the Indian laborer was 1:30,000. If you take Enron, which imposed its project on the richest state in India, which now faces bankruptcy because of that, mainly because of that project, it destroyed a number of welfare projects because of the amount of losses run up by the state in this adventure. Enron was promoted by 3 companies, by Enron, Bechtel and General Electric. Who headed General Electric at the time? The incredible Jack Welch. This project displaced hundreds of farmers in that region for a project that bankrupted the state, the richest state in the country. Most of those farmers are women farmers because it's a high migration area and most of the farms are women-headed households. Now if you compare the wage of that woman who's lost even that income, she's even lost that income. She was earning about 4,500 rupees as a farmer. How did it compare with the top CEO model of Krugman, Jack Welch, who retired on a final package of $123 million, an exclusive box in the baseball stadium, and a private jet? But, I mean, let's admit that he did make sacrifices. When people got angry, he gave up the baseball box. Okay? So, she gave up her entire livelihood, involuntarily. Maybe even her life. The gap between them was not 1:30,000. It was 1:1.2 million. That's the gap between that $123 million, and I'm not counting the perks, I'm just counting the cash. Between the $123 million and her 4,500 rupees, the gap is 1:1.2 million. How can you sustain such obscene gaps? How can you sustain that kind of inequality? How can you sustain the kind of inequality which the New York Times acknowledges 3-4 days ago in its front page on the failure of water privatization in Latin America, though it never criticizes a corporation, American corporation by name, for the kind of mess that now plagues Latin America. It blames the governments of Latin America. And I'm sure that's right. Let's make it very clear that in this neoliberal global model, it's not wrong just to say that the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank or the WTO imposed something on the Indian government. The Indian government is filled with elites who readily welcomed what was imposed and took great delight in imposing it on their populations as well. Okay? It is an ideological outlook. It is a mindset. It's the mindset of inequality. It's the mindset of neoliberal globalism. So thousands of farmers have committed suicide around the world. All these things have happened. Inequality gets worse and worse and worse and explodes. Even in terms of wars, it explodes. By the way, speaking of outsourcing, there's never any protest over outsourcing of war. There's pressure again on us to send troops to Iraq because you see now we've held fair and free elections. Right? After all, There's plenty of expertise here in holding fair and free elections. Ask Ohio or Florida and they'll tell you. Right, so they've held them now in Iraq. But a number of countries are being asked on the old Roman model to send troops. And by the way, if you're from Latin America or someplace, you fight for the American army for a certain number of years and you actually stay alive, then you can apply for citizenship. It's the old Roman model. Okay, we should know. We lost hundreds of thousands of lives fighting for British imperialism. In the same Iraq, we lost 8,000 troops in a single battle, in the Battle of Kut in 1916. And it was for the same rhetoric, regime change. Because the Brits had taken a bashing at Gallipoli from the Turks. The Brits had to explain to their population why tens of thousands more people had to die. So they desperately needed a propaganda victory. At that time, the ragged, wretched Indian 6th Army, which had seen months of fighting without respite, was asked to go and change the regime in Baghdad. They were cut to pieces, caught between Turks, Kurds, Iraqis, Shiites, Sunnis. The outsider always ended up uniting everyone else. Okay? So that we did that. Then we were asked to die for British imperialism. Now we are asked to die for American imperialism. The Irish had the right take on this, you know. They had the right take. They always said, the sun never set on the British Empire because even God can't trust those bastards in the dark. Now, whether it's in the sphere of war, whether it's in the sphere of economics, whether it's in the sphere of culture, whether it's in the WTO, the World Bank, the IMF, or in the lives of ordinary people, we've structured an incredible inequality that threatens every kind of decent human norm. And yet it is unraveling. You've seen it unraveling at Seattle, at the WSF, in the Indian elections, which terrify the Wall Street Journal with an almost apocalyptic vision about democracy being perverse. Things are going awry. Resistance is growing. I want to end with this one thing that I'd like to share with you from my... I wasn't trained as a journalist, I was trained as a historian. And some 26 years ago, speaking of the Roman model, I read the Roman historian Tacitus. Tacitus and the Annals, Nero and the burning of Rome, in which Tacitus, who though he hated Nero, was honest enough to say that Nero had not in fact set Rome on fire, but he was scared as hell that people believed he did. So he had to do something to distract the population of Rome. And what did he do? He decided to hold the biggest party ever held in the history of the Roman Empire. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle, as Tacitus says in book 15 of the Annals. You can look. One of the nice things is that you can look up Tacitus on the net today. Some university in the United States has put up Tacitus fully on the net. And Tacitus said they had a problem with this party. Because his garden was a concave kind of a place, you know, and surrounded by higher spots. And it was a bit dark. The problem was how to provide nightly illumination for the party, to which anyone who was anyone in Rome was an invitee. The intelligentsia, the gossip columnists certainly, the political correspondents, I'm sure they were there because they subsequently wrote books about it, like Tacitus. Anybody who mattered in Rome was at that party. And they had the problem of nightly illumination. How did they solve the problem of nightly illumination? They solved the problem, writes Tacitus, by bringing wretched criminals and prisoners and burning them at stake around the garden. Now, by the way, it's not just Tacitus who says this. Other contemporary historians also corroborate this incident. Now, we are not going to worry ourselves about Nero. Okay? Nero was nuts, we know that. Unlike all those other just and sane Roman emperors who routinely fed thousands of human beings to the lions, he was nuts. They were the good old salt of the earth. The issue is not Nero. The issue is Nero's guests. Who were the guests at that party? What sort of mentality and mindset did it require? What sort of mindset did it require? To pop another fig as another human being went up in flames. What sort of... These were not These were people who were the intellect of Rome. These were the best and the finest. They knew what was happening. They could see what was happening. In this case, they did not have the option of averting their gaze. It happened in front of their eyeballs. For me, I was always mystified about who Nero's guests were, much more than any interest in Nero. When I started, I have been a rural reporter for 12 years, covering many things that cheer me up, many things that make me optimistic, many things that convince me that democratic and popular movements will prevail against neoliberal globalization. But one of the things that breaks me up is the covering of the ending of thousands of human lives through suicide, which are unnecessary, which need not occur. In the last 5 years of covering these, I've answered my question about who were Nero's guests. I guess we all are. One more farmer goes up in flames. One more widow takes her life. One more farm goes bust for no fault of its own. But the party continues. Apart from the many strategies we can discuss about what to do, I think one starting point we can all agree on and what we can do. I think in this world of inequality, we can refuse to be Nero's guests. Thank you.
You've been listening to a presentation by the award-winning rural reporter, author, and photojournalist, P. Sainath. The title of his presentation is Globalizing Inequality. In a moment, we'll return to the question and answer session from the program. P. Sainath has been reporting on social justice, poverty, and the impacts of globalization in rural India for over 14 years. He is the rural affairs editor for the Indian English-language daily newspaper, The Hindu, which is available online at www.hindu.com. And he is a regular contributor to India Together, also available online at www.indiatogether.org. In addition to his regular articles and columns, P. Sainath is author of the book Everybody Loves a Good Drought, Stories from India's Poorest Villages. And now we return to the question and answer session from the program. You're listening to rural reporter and photojournalist P. Sainath. He spoke at the Washington State University, Vancouver campus on February 25, 2005. The first question for P. Sainath was, what can we do to sensitize readers of English-language newspapers in India to the importance of these issues, since they probably do not care that much about the plight of farmers and the impoverished in rural India?
You know, I respectfully beg to differ with your conclusion that people don't care. One. Two, I would argue, as a journalist in his 25th year, that it has never been an issue of people not being interested. Never. That has never been my experience, or I would have quit the profession long ago. If you look at my book, you'll find that the first chapter, the first preface, is headlined, not what the readers want, because that's what 20 editors told me while rejecting my project. It's not what the proprietors want. Don't blame the victim. The victim didn't ask. The reader didn't ask for many of these stories. The reader doesn't have a damn choice if that paper is a monopoly and the only game in town, like the Times of India and Mumbai. One of the things that I found really hilarious, are you familiar with the Hindi language press names of newspapers? Yeah. Before I left India, Dainik Bhaskar ran half a page on Eminem. In the Hindi belt, the relevant, I only got to know about it because a friend of mine, a Hindi journalist, a very well-informed guy, was asking me, "Ye banda kaun?" You know, a half page on Eminem, the rapper, in a part of the world that has no idea what the heck you're talking about. It has nothing to do with what the readers want. It has to do with what advertisers want, with trying to build a particular kind of culture, with trying to invent a particular kind of reader, and that has been the incredible success of the Times of India. They've invented readership. By the way, it all happened here much earlier than in India. When I first visited this country in 1984, The top gossip columnist, I don't remember her full name, Betty something, had just retired. And she was interviewed by Time magazine. In one sentence, she summed up everything. They asked her, so Betty, she was retiring to do painting at home. Okay? And they asked her, so Betty, why are you quitting? She said, you guys have taken it away. You've put gossip on the front page. What do I do? Okay? And I think that just about said it. There was a conscious decision to promote the trivial because of advertising, because of sponsorship, because of the sunny side up need to sell products. That had nothing to do with readers. I would not be standing before you today as a journalist if it were not for readers who kept me alive. When 20 editors turned down the project, which led to Everybody Loves a Good Drought, which is now in its 13th print in 7 languages, because readers don't want it. That project got in because I got a Times of India fellowship in the memory or image of their beloved founder, and there was also at that time one of the resident editors who was very interested in such issues. It gave him an excuse to run 3 or 4. They got the largest number of letters they had for any series and that ran to a series of 84 reports on poverty in the Times of India. The readers did want to hear. No reader wants to hear only those stories. No newspaper has only one kind of reader, and I'm talking about general interest newspapers, and no reader has only one kind of interest. They might want some of the other stories, they might want to read things about, but if you look at the newspapers today, they've abolished the issues that affect 70%. If you look at the beats in newspapers, most Indian newspapers, there's no major Indian newspaper in the English language that has an agriculture correspondent full-time. No major newspaper that has a full-time labor correspondent left. What does it mean? It means that we have taken a decision that 70% of the people don't make news. That wasn't a decision taken by the reader. That was a decision taken by corporations who say that these people don't make news, the top 3% do. The beautiful people make news. When I quit my job and became a freelancer, which I was for 11 and a half years, it was on the decision that I'm going to cover the bottom 5%, as an answer to the coverage of the beautiful people. So I would advise you to revisit this issue. It's about what proprietors want, what corporations want, not about what readers want.
The next audience member asked the speaker to talk about positive steps that have been taken in the face of the negative impacts of globalization in rural India.
Well, personally, I believe that there were many major shifts in Indian politics in the 80s and 90s that were of a positive nature, but are now threatened by the kind of changes that have taken place. One, I find when I look at my 25 years as a journalist, I see an attitudinal change in people from when I went to, say, Chhattisgarh 24 years ago. People spoke to me with extreme servility. Hand across the chest, hand over the mouth, bent over to address you because you wore a pant and a shirt and were obviously somebody very important. Today when I go to the same places, I see people with their chests sticking out, and I see a gigantic story in that change. The ruled are no longer able to rule in the old way. The ruled are no longer willing to be ruled in the old way. The rulers are not able to rule in the old way. There's a challenge to the authority at every point. Second, people are far more conscious of their rights than they were some years ago. They may not be able to enforce them as they would like to, but they are very conscious of them. Third, for me, the huge positive thing, the greatest positive thing in recent times, as I said, was that 600 million poor people went and showed the world what democracy was about. They were lined up against the most powerful array of forces in the country. A government that spent billions of rupees on propaganda promoting a concept called India Shining, ignoring the India that was burning. Promoting a slogan called the Feel Good Factor, mass production, which I called the Feel Good Factory. With all the experts telling them to do otherwise, the voter went and did exactly the opposite. That for me itself measures one of the great shifts, that it's a tectonic shift, that we are not going to listen to you. We are going to do what we think is right. That was one. Third. Fourth, there has been, in the last 20 years, an upsurge of the oppressed. Their participation levels in politics is far more. 5, local governance being brought in by constitutional amendments in India called the Panchayati Raj, the village council governance, has brought into governance people who were excluded from any form of participation in the village life, untouchables, Dalits as we call them, as they call themselves more accurately. They came and a Dalit woman can be the president of a village now. This was unheard of before 1993 except in 2 states. Okay? Yet, having all those positive changes, now we have a situation where the Dalit woman might enter parliament, but parliament means very little. Because it has ceded its sovereignty to the WTO and agriculture. At the very moment when the excluded are entering the halls of governance, the levers of power have less and less power because someone else is making the decision away from the country, outside the economy. So that's one conflict. So it's an ongoing struggle, but there are many positive things, and for me the 2004 elections was absolutely the most positive. Second, all over the world huge struggles are taking place. Let me give you one example in India just now. If you I visited a district in Kerala. While going to Wayanad, I landed in a state called Tamil Nadu and drove past one district which strangely disoriented me. It took me 20 minutes to figure out why I was so disoriented while traveling in the district of Palakkad. And then I realized this district, for about kilometers and kilometers, there is not a single sign of Coca-Cola or Pepsi. The people have abolished these things in that district. There's a huge struggle going on over water resources, and the next big struggle in the world is going to be about privatization of water. Okay, which is what the corporations are about, because that's the biggest market left until they figure out oxygen, which they're trying in Kyoto. Okay, I mean they made a modest start there, but every day Coke and Pepsi drain off billions of liters of groundwater from Indian farmers. It's leading to physical fights and conflicts between police supporting Coke and Pepsi and the farmers. In this district of Palakkad, in a place called Plachimeda, Coke has sunk thousands of bore wells much deeper than any poor farmer can afford to go, and sucked off their water. In the state of Karnataka next door, a neighboring state of Karnataka to Kerala, the state government actually created a project for Coke and Pepsi where they get 5 years of water free. In a nation which is under severe water stress for farming, for fresh water. Okay? There are now soft drink companies, factories belonging to these guys, which don't put up their nameplate because they're so scared of the public coming along and beating the life out of them. So these fights are going on. People are getting conscious that they're being robbed, and they are fighting. Yeah. Yes.
The next audience member gave an account of the way the timber industry in Oregon has used the commercial media to promote a corporate perspective. He describes how in the 1940s there had been a large forest fire in the coastal range of Oregon that burned several thousand acres. Replanting and recovery work was undertaken by Cub Scouts and individual volunteers, basically by the people of the state of Oregon. Those forests that have regrown and recovered are on state-owned land. Now that the timber has matured, the timber companies want to go into these areas and harvest the trees. There was a petition, a ballot initiative, that would have allocated half of the resources of that state-owned forest land to be set aside and protected for non-timber uses. The companies that were after the timber launched a huge campaign, paying for radio and television advertisement that showed forest fires and argued that it was hikers and other people using the forests who were responsible for the forest fires and for the wasteful destruction of the forests. This timber industry advertising campaign was successful, and the ballot measure was defeated. After the initiative was defeated, a researcher at one of the local colleges published his findings that all of the fires that have occurred in these forests over the past 300 years have been caused by the companies cutting the trees.
Yeah, I think that's a fairly common story across the world. And I think one of the funniest political cartoons, or saddest, which depending on which way you look at it, on the subject that you're talking about, I saw in this country at the height of the Reagan, at the depth of the Reagan recession. When the recession under Reagan was at its worst, I think it was Herblock, okay? I'm not sure. Maybe it was Oliphant. One of these two. They had this absolutely fantastic cartoon. USS economy is sinking. You know, it's just the bow is above the water. And there are two guys hanging on to the bow. Reagan and his press secretary hanging on with one hand and reading with the other. And the press secretary is saying, Mr. President, according to the latest CBS New York Times poll, your popularity ratings have risen 80%. However, the voters have all drowned. So it's pretty much like that, isn't it? People are sometimes persuaded. Over a period of time, I think that fades. But I think the power of corporations to do that here, in this country, is far greater than anywhere else that I have seen. You know, there is healthy skepticism still left in a lot of other parts of the world. And I'm sure here too. But you're up against much more powerful socialization and ideological processes. Yeah.
The next question from the audience referred back to the case where the commercial media in India had been dead wrong about the outcome of an election. After that experience, did the media behave differently? Was there some acknowledgement of their failure, some moves towards reform?
Okay, that's I think a very good question. For about 15, 20 days, the media, immediately the media were traumatized. You can't look that stupid and you don't know what to say, nothing. Especially when you have written before the elections that elections are no more about mass rallies and going to the people. It's about elections are now to be fought in the television studios. The television studios were strangely depleted. However, the market crash in Bombay started saying that, there has to be restraint. We have to balance voters with investors. We have to do this. That way they started coming back into the picture. Right now, it's as if May 2004 never happened. And that's also aided by another factor. The party that benefited from the victory, from the defeat of the ruling, on coming to power, using the farmers' suicides as an issue, using hunger as an issue, has immediately resorted to identical policies of economics. Identical economic policies as the old government. This is a process, again, you've seen all over the world. The Social Democrats in Europe, the Congress Party in India, some of the parties in Latin America have ridden to power on popular anger on these issues and then switched. Okay? So now, incidentally, when people destroyed the National Democratic Alliance in the parliament, they also devastated the Congress in the states where the Congress was ruling with the same policies. So people really voted against the policies, not for a party. But the luck of the draw brings the Congress to power. The Congress has some allies or consultants or whatever cohorts who are against these policies. The media fire is concentrated totally on those allies in the left, saying, these guys are going to ruin the country, they're bringing it down. You know what the demand of the allies of the Congress is? Honor your program. When a party gets elected on one promise and switches, the media call it pragmatic. That's the word worldwide. It's pragmatic. They're doing something pragmatic. And that's a good thing. The media are part of that system, by and large. In India, we have a much richer spectrum in the media than you do here. But even then, we're on the same model. We'll get to where you are. We're in the same model. We're trying very hard to emulate you and stifle diversity. If you look at both India and US, I consider the United States to be the second most diverse nation I know after my own. If you look at the level of the population of the United States, there's incredible heterogeneity. How many races you have, how many peoples you have, how many people from how many continents, from how many countries in South Asia, Africa, Latin America you have in this country. In the borough of Queens in New York, some 100 to 115 languages are spoken. At the level of the population, you have such incredible heterogeneity. At the level of your media, you have the most amazing homogeneity. That's the point. At the level of people, you have these 115 languages. At the level of media, you have Clear Channel and Jerry Springer. And O'Reilly for variety, right? So that homogeneity in the media, which is a corporate homogeneity, is what makes it very difficult to fight this. In India, the levels of monopoly are not so total as yet, though they are fairly advanced compared to 20 years ago. So people still make the media look like monkeys every now and then. But it's an ongoing battle. You cannot take... A few in the media did reevaluate their position. They wrote, yeah, maybe we misread this, etc., etc. There was some amount of breast beating for 15, 20 days, and then it's back to business as usual. Yeah.
The next audience member commented on some of the difficulties experienced by groups organizing on these sorts of issues in rural India. He asks what kind of critical mass of organizing and support do these efforts need in order to begin to show some progress?
See, those are very, very, very large issues. But if you look at, say, if you look at the TDP, you look at the Telangana Rashtriya Samiti, the TRS, these guys, there are lots of things that are very interesting. And it also connects up in some ways with the kind of socialization process and media monopoly stuff that he's raising. Whether it's the NRI promotion of what was happening in my home state of Andhra Pradesh as this incredible thing. It was also a Western projection of what was happening in Andhra Pradesh to some extent. Andhra Pradesh, the Telangana region, and many of these regions symbolize some of the basic failures of the Indian state in the last 40, 50 years. We've not addressed certain pressing land issues. We've not solved them. Telangana did have a radical land reform, land distribution, after which the movement of Telangana, as you know very well, was crushed physically. So there is a tradition there which knows better, which wants better. But we are not willing to address land issues. 85% of the Indian poor, who are the Indian poor? 40% of the Indian poor are landless agricultural laborers, 45% are small and marginal farmers earning an acre or less, 7.5% are rural artisans, your potters, weavers, and all the other groups, including the urban poor, make up the remaining 7.5%. What does it tell you? It tells you that 85% of the poor, their problem is directly related to land. It's the one issue that no central government in the last 15 years has had anywhere within a mile of its agenda. The same applies to Bihar. This is where the maximum amount of land-related violence is emerging, because these issues are stubbornly resisted. That's one thing. The second is that on such a base, with such kinds of problems as Andhra had, you had to build a fake model where the worse the situation was, the greater the achievements were touted. How many people know that in this tiger economy, when Mr. Naidu ran Andhra Pradesh, how many people knew that Andhra Pradesh had the lowest GDP growth in the south of India? In his 9 years, the lowest GDP growth of any southern state was Andhra Pradesh. It was lower than the national average, lower than Andhra itself between 1981 and 91. Its rank amongst the states fell from number 4 to number 8. In the National Family Health Surveys, one was held in 91, one in 97, 98. The only southern state that did not show improvement in infant mortality rates in the south was Andhra Pradesh. Its educational performance is the worst in the south. The literacy rate of Cyberabad, the great miracle software capital, is lower than that of Patna in Bihar. Okay, but it was a Globalizing thing. If you shouted the lie often enough and loudly enough, it worked. It worked for those for whom it was meant to work. Unfortunately, it did not work at the level of the population, who knew and know that their basic concerns were not addressed. And I want to show you that in the Telangana region, when the defeat came for the TDP, in Cyberabad, their centerpiece for the entire universe, out of 15 seats, they lost all but 2. Even in the place where they should have had the maximum success, they were wiped out. So so there's this huge gap between mass media, mass reality, between what the elites are addressing and the issues that people are raising.
The next member of the audience described how a dairy farmers association in Oregon, a group of about 150 farmers, was challenging the Monsanto Corporation. This association is the second largest distributor for their particular dairy products in the country, and they've chosen not to use bovine growth hormone because their customers have told them they don't want it in their food. The Monsanto Corporation is telling them that they have to buy their product. They have to use the growth hormone that Monsanto markets to the farmers. How do you get this kind of story out to a broader public?
If it has already entered the production chain, it's going to be very, very, very difficult. One of the things with the whole experimentation and what they did, what Monsanto and others did in India, for instance, will give you an idea. We had, after the Green Revolution, a seed certification regime, which meant that seeds, when you put a packet of seeds on the market, you had to guarantee that 90%, 85 to 90% would germinate, because no packet can have a 100% germination rate. This didn't suit Monsanto and the other big companies that were entering India in the 90s. They negotiated with the same Andhra Pradesh government and introduced memoranda of understanding, bypassing farmers, bypassing farm unions, bypassing, seed experts, everything, and put out an MOU where the the guaranteed germination rate was reduced to 60%. So today, if you buy 1,000 bags of seed, you pay for 1,000 bags, but you get 600 bags. I didn't know about this. It had happened so silently. I'm a journalist who covers that place. It was brought to my notice by farmers in a village who told me, suppose you went to a pharmacy, to a medical shop, and you were offered a medicine which says 60% of this might work. Would you buy it? I said, no, I wouldn't. And why would you? They said, we have no choice, because they've let loose all these seeds in our market, and every one of them is now, they've lowered the bar. Even our local manufacturers have lowered the bar. Then, to be able to lower the bar, they removed every kind of regulatory mechanism that existed. You know what happened? Not only did BT cotton and other stuff came in, thousands of spurious seeds came in, spurring further suicides. That you cannot trace it, you cannot pin it down, because the regulatory process is gone. Once it entered the production chain, it had devastating effects, and it's very difficult to separate and say this is from here, this is from here. The same is now, I mentioned, pepper is collapsing in Kerala because of the import of cheap pepper. The cheap pepper has not only entered the market, it's entered the production chain. When it's entered the production chain, it's causing pest. Now it's going to take very experienced scientists years to figure out how the hell to fix what has gone wrong. Okay? So it's not easy, it's a very tough job. How do you do it journalistically I think it's even more difficult in your circumstances than in mine. But believe me, to get those suicides onto the agenda, it took 5 years to really make people realize that it was going on. The largest Indian weekly, India Today, poured scorn on the issue of farmer suicides. You cannot find a story on it in the period when they were happening with great intensity. You cannot find a serious story in the largest weekly. But you can work out tactics if your farmers are united, and if your public can be mobilized behind them. Then you have options of how to draw attention to it. The farmers of Andhra Pradesh are now dealing to some extent with spurious seeds by direct action. Okay? And I see no escape for them. They have to do it. What are they doing? When they got spurious seeds, they captured the seed guy who had put 70 million rupees worth of spurious seeds on the market. The government took strong action against him. But the laws are so watered down that the court censured the government and let the guy go with a $10 fine, 500 rupee fine, for putting 70 million rupees worth of spurious seeds into the market. Next time the farmers didn't go to the court. They captured the seed factory and said, do we get compensation or do we get a bonfire? The company paid up. Okay. I'm saying direct action there's no option. All over the world, people are resorting, like the people fighting Coca-Cola over there. They are going to take direct action. It has to be collective action organized in the democratic process of those societies as allowed. So I think that you cannot do it just journalistically. You cannot do it through one great article. I don't believe that the farmers' suicides issue was made though people wrongly credit me with it, I think that was made an issue by the farmers of Andhra Pradesh, by their ceaseless, relentless struggle, and the fact that the public felt very badly about what was happening. People are not intrinsically anti-farmer, not at all. There is a nostalgic thing for every one of us came from a village once. There is in fact a nostalgic affection for the farming community, except that your farming community is corporate, largely. So yes, if you can, that action is not going to, journalistically if you can do something that's good, but it won't be enough. It has to happen at the level of popular action and direct action as well. Yeah.
The next member of the audience described a postcard campaign by Corporate Accountability International, a campaign being supported by the Vancouver-Washington Peace Coalition. The campaign is directed at the Coca-Cola Corporation, telling them to stop stealing water from rural communities of India. The postcard, addressed to the head of Coca-Cola, expresses the concern that bottling factories in India are using local water resources to such a degree that it is having a very serious impact on local communities and farmers. It is estimated that 2/3 of the world's population will not have enough water by 2025 unless steps are taken to address the issue. The postcard demands that Coca-Cola stop stealing water, and specifically that they close their plants in 2 cities in India. This audience member asks if this kind of campaign is effective.
I have no idea about the group you're talking about, but the facts contained in it are broadly correct. And I don't know whether what kind of action your local groups choose to take, I'm not aware of. I know the action that is taken on the ground, and I'm very supportive of it. See, I should tell you one thing, that water theft that they're speaking about, it's costing human lives. And incidentally, if you look at the Indian politics and the Indian polity, every major political crisis in India has had water involved in it. In the south of India, the biggest political explosion is between Tamil Nadu and Karnataka over Kaveri waters. The biggest dispute between the next 2 southern states, Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh, is over the Almaty waters. The biggest dispute within Andhra Pradesh is over the Krishna Waters Tribunal Award for Mehboob Nagar and other districts. The biggest dispute in the north, which led to an explosion in the 80s, was over the Ravi Bees sharing dispute, which was at the basis of the Punjab problem in the 80s and 90s. Our single biggest dispute with our neighbor Bangladesh is over the Faraka Barrage water sharing. Our single biggest dispute with our neighbor Nepal is over the Kosi Barrage water sharing. Water is a gigantic and explosive issue. It's tearing communities apart. In that situation, the luxury of taking it away for amusement parks, water parks, golf courses, soft drinks factories is simply unaffordable. In a desert state called Rajasthan in India, they have a plan of putting a large number of golf courses as part of tourism. The average golf course in the West takes between 1.8 million and 2.3 million liters of water per day in season. If you take the whole season, 20 villages in Rajasthan can see the entire summer through on that amount of water. People are dying without that water. In Rajasthan, over water disputes and farming disputes, 4 farmers were shot dead 2-3 months ago by the police in one of these struggles. This is going to intensify and intensify, and we are going to decide in the Nero's Guest syndrome whether soft drinks are more important than human lives. We have to take that decision. And I'm saying that farming is being destroyed. If you're a small farmer, and I'm a big company and I come and put much deeper bore wells, much more bore wells than you can ever afford, you're dead no matter how good, how skilled a farmer you are. And that's what's happening, and that's Plachimada, that's absolutely correct. That's why there's a huge struggle there. Now, I'm not aware of the group that you've mentioned, but I'm pleased that someone's talking about it. I'm really pleased and grateful to that extent, because the facts reflected in that are correct and honest. Yeah.
The next member of the audience followed up on the previous question. He described the work of Corporate Accountability International and recommended their website at www.stopcorporateabuse.org. He described an earlier campaign by the organization, which was formerly known as InFact, which targeted the Nestle Corporation for their marketing of infant formula in developing countries. That campaign, which included a sustained boycott against the Nestle Corporation, was ultimately successful in forcing reforms. The current campaign, targeting the Coca-Cola Corporation, has not escalated to the level of a boycott, but these postcards and other pressure may have an effect, and certainly it is possible to move to a boycott or to direct action to increase the pressure for change. Although it is not easy to estimate the impact of these kinds of campaigns, it is clear that such campaigns have had an impact in the past.
Let me offer you a personal example and confession. Till 2001, I was a very big consumer of colas and I love them. Okay? But I used to drink an Indian soft drink called Thumbs Up, which since has been bought out by Coca-Cola, leaving me with no options, and therefore I am relatively sugar-free in recent years. However, the reason I gave it up was because of Andhra Pradesh and a district called Anantapur, where the maximum number of farmers' suicides have taken place. I was drinking, I'm a big cola consumer till 2001. I went to an area called Nallamada in Anantapur. It's a place where you used to get, within Anantapur's bad situation, you used to get good, decent, very sweet-tasting groundwater in Nallamada. In 2001, when I was looking in the suicides of Nallamada, people were very reluctant to offer me water. And I said, no, I want water, give me water because I'm thirsty. And they very shamefacedly gave me a glass of water which was it was brown in color and had sediment floating on the top. And then one of the farmers very apologetically told me, see, we didn't want to give you this water, but tell me, sir, why don't you take a Coca-Cola that we have? It was their water that went into that Coca-Cola. From that day, I stopped drinking Coca-Cola. I mean, it was not possible. I still like cola, but I find it's not possible to think about that when that was a life and death situation that I'm trying to talk about. Yeah. Yes.
The next question for P. Sainath asked if there were particular strategies adopted by pressure groups and communities that have been successful or have contributed to progress in these efforts.
You know, apart from the movements that have succeeded, I would say that even the movements that we may not count as successes have left some legacy which works, some tactics that work, some issues that remain with us. So I'm never going to write off all of them as total failures because they teach us something even as they fail. Yeah. I personally think the challenge and the huge trick is in marrying the different energies now loose in the global and national arena. You can no longer say, think globally, act locally. You've got to think globally, you've got to think locally, you've got to act locally, you've got to act globally. The whole plate is on your table now, right? You can't evade. But there are so many specific issues floating about, and this is what I wonder when I look at the WSF and say maybe we need to think a little further. How do we get these energies together? Speaking of positives, I think that the elections in Venezuela were a great positive. With the entire might of the United States and all the corporations of the world ranged against Venezuela, the people from the poor hutments and slums and chawls went out and put back in power, not once but twice or thrice, the government that they wanted. So I think that in some countries that failed. Yeah, but people didn't necessarily stop trying. So I think that how do we marry these energies of these different movements together? If you're going to have transnational oppression, then you've got to have transnational resistance as well. There have been examples of some things like that happening when the first Bush War, what was the third Gulf War and the first Bush War was fought, there was coordination which just came about between Australian longshoremen and Indian sailors in Calcutta. Okay? About not offloading anything meant for war. They would do everything else but not touch weaponry, not touch anything that they felt was, feeding into the war effort. So I think you're going to have to look at how people can coordinate across boundaries, across continents to make these movements. But I think also it is wrong to start acting as if globalization is something in itself the source of all the problems, and that if we adjust or fix neoliberal globalism, the other problems of, there's something called capitalism too. And there used to be a word called imperialism. A lot of people have forgotten it. And there are words like exploitation which no longer appear in the newspapers. Those issues too you can't run away from. You've got to face those too. You've got to face those nationally, locally, issues of resource control, concentration, monopolies, local and national. Right? Even what we are fighting at is the large rubric which has, encompassed all these issues. But it's not the only one. So I think, how do we work out how do we work out strategies that marry all the progressive energies into major movements rather than just be an anti-Coca-Cola movement or just an anti-Pepsi movement? These are very important. How do you integrate them into other movements that are also, or link them to other movements that are also very important? That's one. Second, how do we balance this national and global? The land monopolies of India were an issue before neoliberal globalization. They become a much worse issue under neoliberal globalization. It's made things much worse, but they have other roots as well. So how do we differentiate between the layered nuances of these crises and work with them? I think it'll happen. I think that the way people have shown support for the Plachimada struggle from all over the world is one example. So yeah, and though it's 20 years late, even today groups all over the world are taking up Union Carbide and Bhopal. So some sort of wider consciousness is coming. I wouldn't say that all those movements have failed. I'd say there were elements that we can take from what happened and learn. Yeah, sorry.
You've been listening to a presentation by the award-winning reporter and photojournalist P. Sainath. The title of his presentation is Globalizing Inequality. He spoke at the Washington State University, Vancouver campus on February 25, 2005. P. Sainath has been reporting on social justice, poverty, and the impacts of globalization in rural India for over 14 years. He is the rural affairs editor of the Indian English-language daily newspaper, The Hindu, which is available online at www.hindu.com. And he is a regular contributor to India Together, also available online at www.indiatogether.org. This program was produced by PDX Justice Media Productions. To find out more about our work, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. You'll find lectures and interviews featuring such speakers as Naomi Klein, Barbara Ehrenreich, Jeff Halper, Amira Haas, Rashid Khalidi, Noam Chomsky, and many others. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, independent bookstores, and all forms of grassroots, democratic, community media.